$3. That's what they said she was worth. Less than a mule, less than a man's pride. But when the Apache woman on that sun-blasted block raised her chin and said, "I would rather die," the desert itself went silent. And in that breathless stillness, one man, Clay Ryker, reached into his pocket and changed both their fates forever. The noon sun baked the world flat and cruel. Heat shimmered above the cracked earth, the air thick with sweat, dust, and cheap whiskey. Flies buzzed around the auction block where men on horseback circled like vultures. On that splintered platform stood Tayen, hands bound, chin lifted, paint still wet on her face, an Apache warrior dressed in pride, not shame. Jed Harkness, the auctioneer, fidgeted under her gaze. He'd sold cattle, horses, even men on debt, but never anyone who looked at him like that, as if memorizing his face for the day she'd reclaim her soul. $5, he barked, voice cracking. Silence. 4? Still nothing. The men shifted, uneasy. A hawk cried overhead. 3. That was when Tayen spoke. Her words cut through the heat like a knife. "I would rather die." Every man froze. Even the wind stopped. One rider turned his horse and left without a word. And somewhere in the back, Clay Ryker felt something twist inside him. A sound he couldn't unhear, a truth he couldn't ignore. Before he even knew why, his calloused hand was already in his pocket. $3, he said. The crowd parted as he stepped forward, a broad-shouldered rancher with too many miles behind his eyes. He laid 3 wrinkled bills in Harkness's sweaty palm. The auctioneer snatched them fast, as though afraid the man might change his mind. "Sold! Take her and go!" But Clay didn't move. He only looked up at the woman who stood over him like a storm refusing to break. She didn't lower her gaze, didn't flinch. For one long, raw heartbeat, neither of them knew what happened next. The chains came off first. Clay reached for the iron cuffs, moving slow, deliberate, palms open. Tayen recoiled as if the touch itself burned. When he freed her wrists, the metal dropped to the planks with a dull clang, a sound that somehow felt louder than any gunshot. She stepped down, bloodless wrists marked red with weeks of captivity. The crowd melted away, eager to forget the ugliness they'd witnessed. Clay offered water. "I'm not thirsty," she said. He nodded toward his horse. "There's food, shade." Her eyes flashed. "You think $3 buys my gratitude?" Before he could answer, she grabbed a rock and hurled it at a lingering spectator's horse. The beast reared, chaos bursting like a shot. Clay put himself between her and the rifles that rose in anger. "Ride on!" he barked. "Man's lost his mind," someone muttered. But they left. When the dust settled, Tayen was gone, sprinting barefoot into the white horizon, straight into the wasteland called Devil's Anvil. No shade, no water, nothing but death. Clay watched her vanish into the shimmering heat. He knew the desert would kill her long before nightfall. Yet something in him, maybe guilt, maybe something older, wouldn't let her go. He waited 10 minutes, then he swung into the saddle and followed. He caught up as she stumbled, breath tearing in her throat. Her legs gave out, her skin scorched. He rode past her, then circled his mare, cutting off her path. "Move!" she hissed, voice ragged. "There's nothing out here but bones," Clay said evenly. "No water for 20 miles. I'll take my chances with the dust." "Why?" he demanded. "What did I do to you besides unchain you?" "You paid for me," she spat. "That makes me owned in the eyes of every man who saw it. $3 or 300, it's the same." Clay dismounted, keeping distance. "I'm not here to own you." "Men like you don't give choices," she snapped. "You're right about some of us," he admitted, voice rough. He tossed his canteen between them. But right now I'm just trying to keep you alive." She stared at the water like it was poison. Pride warred with thirst until instinct won. She lunged, grabbed the canteen, drank deep, then flung it back at him. "What's your name?" he asked. "None of your business." "Fair enough. I'm Clay Ryker. Used to run cattle north. Not much left to run now." He gestured west. "There's a trading post, May Colby's place. You'll be safe there." She didn't move. The wind whipped her braids like black fire. "If you ever touch me," she said finally, "I'll take your eyes before you draw a second breath." Clay nodded. Understood. Neither spoke again. She turned west and began walking. He followed, 20 feet behind, silent, stubborn, shadowed by a sun that refused to forgive. The desert didn't care what they were, savior, captive, ghosts. It only cared who would still be standing when the night came down. And for now, both of them walked that line, a $3 rope of fate stretched tight between mercy and defiance. Out here, freedom and death look a lot alike. But sometimes, one man's mercy costs more than any bullet. Don't miss what comes next. The deal, the fire, the reckoning. Hit subscribe and ride with us into part 2. The Devil's Bargain. The sun had crawled down the sky, burning itself out in streaks of copper and red. The desert wind turned cool, sharp, biting through sweat-soaked shirts and pride alike. Clay Ryker led his mare along the rocky flats while Tayen walked 20 paces ahead, her silhouette ragged against the dying light. She hadn't said a word in an hour. Didn't have to. The way she kept her back straight, the way her chin cut the air. It was enough. She was still fighting him, even in silence. Clay knew better than to press her. He'd been married once, raised a daughter. He recognized that kind of fury. Not the kind that burned quick, but the kind that lived deep in the bones, the kind that would never be talked down. They stopped when the sun dipped below the ridgeline. Clay found a patch of hard ground between 2 stones and dropped his saddle with a grunt. Tayen didn't stop until she was 30 feet away. He could barely make her shape in the fading light. "Fire'll help keep the coyotes off," he said. "Coyotes ain't the danger." Her voice carried clean through the dusk, calm and cutting. He struck a match anyway. "You can sit closer. Heat don't ask questions." She ignored him, so he built the fire small, just enough to fight the chill creeping up from the desert floor. Sparks rose, tiny dying stars swallowed by night. When the smell of smoke drifted her way, Tayen finally turned. Her face flickered in the half-light. Dust, sweat, the smudge of paint across her cheek. Her eyes caught the fire like amber glass. "That thing you said," she murmured, "about keeping me alive. You say it like it's a favor?" Clay looked up from the fire. "No, it's a debt." Her lips curled. Not quite a smile, not quite anger. "Debt to who?" He didn't answer right away. The truth was too ugly to give a name. "Doesn't matter," he said. "I've owed too many people for too long. Figure I start paying one back." She studied him, head tilted, reading his face like she'd read a trail. "You talk like a man who's already buried his soul." "Maybe I did," he said softly. "Maybe I'm just digging it up." The silence that followed was heavy. The wind picked up, dragging sand through the firelight like smoke. After a long moment, Tayen crouched by the flames. The warmth brushed her face, and she closed her eyes. Only for a heartbeat. But Clay saw it. The smallest crack in her armor. "You from here?" he asked quietly. "Farther south. My people followed the rivers, till the soldiers came." She didn't look at him as she spoke. Her voice was steady, flat as the plains. "They wanted land. We wanted to live. They called it war. We called it surviving." Clay poked the fire with a stick. "You said there were children. There were, she said. 14. I sent them into the caves when the soldiers came. Told them I'd find them when it was safe. He looked up. You mean you surrendered yourself? She met his eyes. I bought them time. Clay swallowed hard. And they lied, she said simply. Told me the children were free. Then they chained me, same as the others. But lies can't live long in the desert. They dry out and die under the sun. Her words cut deep, not because of the pain in them, but because of how little of it she showed. He stared into the fire, the flames dancing in his tired eyes. You killed 2 of them. She didn't flinch. They tried to take what wasn't theirs. I made sure no one tried again. There was no pride in it. No shame either. Just truth. Clay nodded once. That's why Harkness couldn't sell you. That's why you could, she replied. He almost laughed. Short, rough, humorless. You think I bought you? What else would you call it? I call it bad timing and worse judgment. For the first time, she smiled. A small, dangerous thing. Then we understand each other. The fire popped. Coyotes cried somewhere beyond the ridges. Clay pulled his coat tighter. You said the trading post's west, she said after a while. What's there? A woman named May Colby. Runs the place with a shotgun and a temper. Helps folks that need help. You trust her? I don't trust anyone, he said. But I owe her too. She looked into the flames again, quiet. Men like you always owe somebody. Funny thing is, it's never yourselves. He couldn't argue with that. When the fire burned low, Tayen rose and brushed the dust from her dress. We leave before dawn. I want to move before the heat. Clay nodded. You'll ride with me. I walk. You won't make it far on foot. Then I die free, she said. Clay stood, his shadow falling across hers. You think freedom's about dying on your own terms. Maybe it's about living when the world's already told you you're not supposed to. That made her pause. Her eyes found his in the dark, searching, measuring. Then she turned away, silent again. He watched her until she lay down against the rock, her back to him, the firelight painting the curve of her shoulder in red gold. Somewhere out in the emptiness, the wind shifted, carrying the faint cry of a hawk. Or maybe something darker. Clay's hand went to his revolver by instinct. Tomorrow would bring more than heat. He could feel it in the stillness, the kind of quiet that came before a storm. He glanced toward Tayen, her body curled against the stone, breathing steady. $3, he thought. That's what it took to buy himself a ghost. Dawn came slow and gold, dragging its light across the desert like a weary hand. Clay Ryker woke before the sun, same as he had for 20 years, by instinct more than choice. He rolled his shoulders, feeling the ache of old bones and older guilt. The fire had burned down to gray dust. Tayen sat a few yards away, back straight, legs crossed, eyes fixed on the horizon. She hadn't slept. When Clay stood, she didn't move. Didn't even look at him. But her jaw tightened, a quiet reminder that she was still deciding whether to trust him or slit his throat the moment she found her knife again. You ride, he said. We'll cover more ground before the heat sets in. I walk. He adjusted the saddle cinch, calm as stone. You'll drop before midday. Then I drop, she said, her voice even, but I'll do it on my feet. Clay sighed. Suit yourself. They started west, the world turning pale with light. Sand hissed under their boots, and the air thickened with heat. Hours passed like miles of silence. When the sun climbed high enough to sting their eyes, Tayen finally stumbled. Clay caught her before she hit the ground. Her elbow drove into his ribs, sharp, fast. She tore free, spinning, ready to strike again. "Easy," he grunted, backing off with both palms raised. "You faint, you die, I ain't looking to bury you." Her breath came ragged, her skin slick with sweat. The desert didn't care about pride. It just waited for weakness. "Water," he said, tossing the canteen toward her. Tayen stared at it like it was a snake. Her fingers twitched, then curled into fists. "You don't stop owning someone just because you hand them water." "I ain't owning you," Clay said, his tone low, tired. "I'm just trying not to watch you die." She didn't answer, but she drank. Deep, desperate gulps that dripped down her chin. When she finished, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and threw the canteen back harder than she needed to. "Happy?" she snapped. Clay capped it, tied it to the saddle, and nodded once. "Not yet." They kept walking until the air itself seemed to hum. The land stretched endless, a graveyard of sun and silence. Then, out of the shimmer ahead, Clay saw something, a twisted wooden post jutting from the ground. "Rest stop up ahead," he said. Tayen shot him a look. "What kind of rest stop?" "The kind that used to have water," he said, "if the well's not dry." By the time they reached it, the wind had picked up. Sand whirled around them in thin, stinging ghosts. The well stood half buried in drifted earth, but when Clay dropped the bucket, he heard the faint splash. "Still good." He hauled it up, water sloshing. Tayen watched him, wary, but thirst won again. She knelt and drank straight from the bucket. When she looked up, the sun caught the paint on her face, making it glow like copper and blood. "Why'd you come after me?" she asked suddenly. Clay leaned on the well crank. "Because you wouldn't have made it." "That's not an answer." He rubbed a thumb over the scar along his jaw. "Maybe I wanted to believe a man like me could still do one decent thing." "Decent?" Her voice was bitter as the dust. "You think buying me was decent?" He met her eyes. "I think letting you die would have been worse." For a long moment, neither spoke. The desert hummed around them, alive in its silence. Then Tayen said, quieter now, "You said there's a woman west of here, May Colby. Why help strangers?" Clay looked out toward the far mountains. "Because she once helped me." That seemed to sit with her, heavy, thoughtful. She didn't thank him, didn't soften. But something in her posture changed. Not trust, not yet. Maybe the smallest step toward it. When they set out again, Tayen walked beside the horse instead of ahead of it. By late afternoon, the heat began to fade, and the wind carried a new scent, dry mesquite, faint smoke, a settlement nearby. Clay felt his gut tighten. "Stay close," he said. "We'll pass through quiet." The town wasn't much, a handful of weathered buildings, a water tower leaning against the sky, a general store, a saloon. Dust clung to everything, like the place had long given up trying to be clean. As they crossed the street, a few men outside the saloon stopped talking. Clay felt their eyes crawl over Tayen, her braids, her paint, her bare feet. One of them laughed under his breath. "Well, hell, didn't know we was trading again." Clay stopped dead. His hand hovered near his belt. "Keep walking," he told Tayen quietly. But she turned, her eyes flashing. "That how it works here? Men pay, women vanish?" The laughter died. The men stiffened. One of them spat, the sound sharp in the dust. "Careful, Injun. Tongue like that'll get you buried." Clay stepped forward, voice low and dangerous. "That's enough," the man sneered. "Who the hell are you?" "Someone who don't bury women for talking." The silence that followed was tight as wire. Then Tayen moved first, not with a weapon, just a look. Her eyes met the man's, hard and unflinching, and he dropped his gaze first. Clay exhaled slow. "Come on." They kept walking until the sound of the saloon faded behind them. The road out of town stretched long and empty again. Tayen didn't speak for a while. Then she said, "You didn't have to do that." Clay looked ahead. "Yeah, I did." "You're not like them," she said softly. He gave a dry laugh. "Don't be so sure." The wind carried their silence across the flats. When the sky bled red again, they stopped to make camp. Tayen sat near the fire, pulling her knees to her chest, eyes lost somewhere past the flames. Clay watched her for a while before speaking. "Tomorrow we reach the post. After that, you can go wherever you damn please." Tayen's gaze lifted to meet his. For the first time, her voice softened. "Freedom ain't about going," she said. "It's about choosing to stay." Clay stared into the fire, the glow carving lines deep into his weathered face. Somewhere in his chest, something shifted, small, painful, and real. He didn't answer, didn't need to. The desert had already heard enough. By the time the sun clawed its way up, the desert had already begun to shimmer, a mirage of gold and glass that dared any fool to cross it. Clay Ryker wasn't a fool, but he was close enough. He tightened the reins and squinted at the endless flats ahead, the place locals called Devil's Anvil. Behind him, Tayen moved like a ghost, every step deliberate, measured. Her eyes stayed forward, unblinking against the glare. She didn't ask for water, didn't complain. Just walked, as if pain itself had become her language. Clay glanced back more than once, not because she needed help. She'd sooner bite a rattler than take it, but because the silence between them was starting to sound like memory. "You keep walking like that, you'll burn the soles off your feet," he called out. She didn't slow. "Then I'll keep walking on what's left." He huffed a laugh. "Stubborn don't suit the heat." "Neither does pity," she shot back. That shut him up. The air grew thick, the world collapsing into two shapes, her shadow and his horse. When the horizon began to blur, Clay spotted the faintest glint ahead. An old water trough, half swallowed by dust. He spurred his mare gently. "There," he said. "Water. Maybe." The trough was half full, muddy and warm, but it was something. He poured what he had from his canteen to mix it cleaner. Tayen approached slow, suspicion still riding her shoulders. "It's not poison," Clay muttered. "Not your kind, maybe." He gave her space, watched her kneel, cup her hands, and drink. Water ran over her wrists, raw, scarred, still ringed with the ghosts of shackles. He saw her fingers tremble and looked away, pretending not to notice. When she finished, she rose and said, "You follow me because you owe ghosts, not me. So stop looking at me like I'm one of them." Clay tightened his jaw. "Maybe you are?" Her eyes narrowed, sharp as obsidian. "Then you better learn what kind of ghost you paid for." They walked on. The wind came hard from the east, carrying a storm of dust. Clay pulled his hat low. Tayen wrapped a torn scrap of cloth around her face, her braid whipping behind her like a black banner. The horizon disappeared in a curtain of tan. "Storm's coming fast," Clay warned. "We need cover." "Where?" He scanned the shifting haze. Then he saw it, a dark line cutting across the land like a scar. "Dry creek bed," he said. "Might be shade under the ledge." They ran for it, the wind howling like a living thing. By the time they dropped into the shallow ravine, The world above had turned to swirling dust. Clay unsaddled the mare, let her breathe. Tayen crouched near the rock wall, pulling her knees close. For a while, neither spoke. The sound of wind against stone filled the air, 1,000 whispers clawing for attention. Then, through the gloom, Tayen's voice came soft. "Back there in the town, when that man called me savage, you didn't draw first. You waited." "Wasn't my fight to start," Clay said. "But you ended it." He shrugged. "Only because I've seen what happens when you don't." She studied him for a long moment. "You've killed men." He nodded once. "Plenty. Some that needed it, some that didn't." Her expression didn't change. "And you live with that?" "No," he said quietly. "I just keep waking up anyway." The wind screamed outside, filling the air with grit. Tayen's gaze dropped to her hands. "Where I come from," she said, "the wind carries stories. It remembers who you are, even when you try to forget. Maybe that's why it never stops." Clay stared into the dust swirling at the cave's mouth. "Then I reckon mine's been shouting my name for years." The storm began to ease by late afternoon. A faint light filtered back into the ravine. Clay walked to the edge, scanning the land. "It'll be cooler now," he said. "We can move again." Tayen hesitated. "Where to?" "May Colby's place. You'll get a meal, maybe a bed for the night." "And then?" He looked over his shoulder. "Then you decide. Head north, east, wherever freedom points you." She stood, brushing the dust from her dress. "Freedom," she repeated, like the word tasted foreign. "You think I can just walk into it?" "It's not a door, Tayen," he said. "It's a fight that never ends. You already started it." They climbed out of the ravine as the sun bled into evening. The desert stretched wide and unforgiving again. Tayen walked beside him now, not behind. "You never said," she murmured, "why you came to that auction." Clay's jaw tightened. "Didn't mean to." "But you stayed." He nodded. "Guess I was tired of watching people hang for what I once did in uniform. What was that?" He hesitated, following orders that should have been buried instead of obeyed. For the first time, she didn't answer. She just looked at him, really looked, and something in her eyes shifted. Maybe not forgiveness, but understanding, fragile as dawn. By the time they reached the ridge, the last light burned out behind the mountains. Tayen stopped and pointed. "Look," she said. Below them, the land opened into a sea of color. Scrubgrass glowing under the moon, a ribbon of silver water twisting through the dark. A real river, quiet and clean. She stepped forward, bare feet sinking into cool earth. For a long time, she just stood there, breathing. Then she turned to Clay. "The desert didn't kill us," she said. "Not yet." "Then maybe it means something." He watched her kneel by the water's edge, cupping her hands again. Not to drink this time, but to let it run through her fingers, like proof that she was still alive. Clay sat his tired body down beside her and looked at the reflection of the moon rippling across the surface. Two shadows in the water, one man, one woman, strangers caught in the same current. "Tomorrow," he said, "we ride to May Colby's. After that, you can go your way." Tayen didn't answer right away. Her eyes stayed on the water, her voice barely above the whisper of the river. "Maybe I already have." The desert went quiet after dark. Not silent, never silent, but still in that uneasy way the West could be, where every coyote cry sounded like a warning and every gust of wind whispered something you weren't meant to hear. Clay Ryker built the fire low, mindful of the open land around them. Flames flickered gold against the riverbank where they'd stopped for the night, throwing shadows that bent and shivered like ghosts. Tayen sat on the other side, knees drawn up, eyes fixed on the flames. Her war paint had faded with the sweat and dust of travel, but the symbols still marked her face, stripes of red and black that glowed like ember scars. Clay handed her a piece of jerky. Eat. She didn't take it. You think I've made it this far without knowing hunger? He shrugged. I think even the strong gotta eat. After a moment, she reached across the fire and took it. Her fingers brushed his. Brief, accidental, but he felt it all the same. For someone who'd survived everything she had, her touch was steady, deliberate. They ate in silence for a while. The fire cracked and popped, and somewhere out on the flats, a night bird called. Clay leaned back against his saddle, hat tilted low, eyes half-lidded. But he wasn't sleeping. He could feel Tayen's gaze on him, measuring, studying, waiting for something he hadn't said yet. Finally, she spoke. That mark on your hand, she said. From a burn. He lifted it, turning the rough skin towards the light. Forge accident, long time ago. You were a smith? Blacksmith, ranch hand, soldier? Depends on what year you're asking. Her eyes didn't leave his hand. And the scars on your arm? He hesitated. The question wasn't cruel, just honest. So he gave her the same. Not from work, from war. She nodded slowly, as if that explained everything. War takes things it doesn't return. He met her gaze. You'd know. She looked back at the fire. My brother was a scout. He carried messages through the canyons during raids. When he didn't come back, I found what was left of him hanging outside a fort. Clay said nothing. There wasn't anything worth saying. He used to tell me, she went on, voice low, that fear and hope were the same thing. Both made a person move. Both burned. The firelight caught her face as she spoke, half shadow, half flame. And for the first time, Clay saw her not as the woman he'd bought for 3 crumpled bills, but as something carved out of survival itself. You ever think about leaving this country? He asked quietly. North, maybe, where the land's green and nobody knows your name. Tayen smiled without warmth. Every night. But where would I go? My people scattered. My name burned out of every record. Freedom doesn't come from crossing borders. It comes from not looking over your shoulder. Clay nodded slowly. Guess we both still lookin' then. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of sage and something older, like rain trying to remember where it came from. Tayen rose and walked to the river, crouching to wash her hands. Clay watched her reflection ripple across the dark water, her war paint running in thin streaks down her skin. That paint, he said. You called it a promise once. What's it for? She looked over her shoulder. To remind me who I'm supposed to become. And who's that? The kind of person who keeps the children safe, she said simply. He frowned. Children? Her eyes darkened. The ones I traded myself for. 14 of them. Hiding in the mountains, waiting for me. That hit him like a hammer. He straightened, the fire forgotten. They're still out there? She nodded. If they're alive. How long have they been waiting? 3 weeks. She said it without emotion, but the words were heavy as stone. Clay stared into the fire, jaw tight. Then we find them. Tayen shook her head. You don't owe me that. Maybe not, he said, voice low. But if I ride away now, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering if 14 kids froze to death while I tried to forget the sound of your voice. She studied him for a long moment, the night wind pulling strands of hair across her face. You carry ghosts, she said finally. So do you. That made her smile, faint but real. Then maybe the ghosts will walk lighter if we share the road. Clay chuckled under his breath. Ain't the strangest deal I've made. She turned back to the water. Her hands trembled as she splashed it over her face, washing away the last of the paint. When she came back to the fire, her skin was bare, her expression stripped down to something raw and human. He handed her a blanket from the saddle. She hesitated, then took it. "Don't thank me," he said before she could speak. "I wasn't going to." That earned him a small, rough laugh. They sat until the fire burned low, neither willing to sleep. The stars above them were sharp as nails, the river whispering beside them like it knew every secret they carried. Finally, Tayen broke the silence. "When I first saw you," she said, "I thought you were just another man trying to own what couldn't be owned. And now?" She looked at him across the embers. "Now I think you're just a man trying to be forgiven for something that can't be undone." He didn't deny it. Couldn't. "Maybe that's the same thing," he said quietly. "Maybe it is." The fire cracked, and for a moment their eyes met across the glow, two people carved by loss, lit by the same flame. Out there, beyond the river and the dark hills, the world was waiting, cruel, vast, and merciless. But for this one night, the war was quiet. And when Tayen finally lay down to sleep, Clay stayed awake, watching the coals burn down to ash. He thought of the children in the mountains, thought of the daughter he couldn't save, and he knew, as sure as the dawn that would soon crawl over the ridge, that he'd already made his choice. The fire had burned down to a few orange coals, and the night lay heavy over the desert. Clay Ryker sat awake, boots planted in the dust, rifle across his knees. Tayen slept a few feet away, her breathing soft but restless, her brow furrowed even in dreams. Somewhere beyond the ridge, coyotes yipped at the moon, and the sound carried like laughter from another world. Clay didn't sleep much anymore. Not since the war. Not since the night his daughter's scream had been swallowed by gunfire and orders. The memory came uninvited, same as always, like smoke creeping in through cracks you couldn't seal. He rubbed his face, trying to shake it off, but the ghosts never left. They just waited for quiet. He looked over at Tayen, her face half hidden by her blanket. Strong, proud, broken in places she didn't let show. He understood that kind of ruin. When dawn crept in, soft and gray, Tayen woke first. She stood, wrapped her shawl tight, and walked down to the river without a word. Clay followed a moment later, giving her distance. She knelt by the water, tracing the edge with her fingertips, as if listening for something beneath it. "You dream loud," she said without looking back. He frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You talk when you sleep, saying names." He shifted his weight. "Yeah, guess I do. Her name was Grace," she said quietly. "The one you lost." That stopped him cold. He stared at her. "How'd you—" "I hear things," Tayen said. "Same way you watch too much. A person learns to survive by paying attention." Clay sat down beside the riverbank, jaw tight. "She was 8, my daughter. We were moving civilians out of Mescal Ridge when one of my own men lost his nerve and fired too soon. Chaos, dust, smoke, wrong orders got given. Mine." He swallowed hard. "Next thing I knew, she was gone, caught in the crossfire." Tayen didn't flinch, didn't soften. "And the man who fired? Didn't make it to trial. So you killed him." Clay nodded once. "Didn't fix a damn thing." Tayen looked down at her reflection. "Revenge never does. But sometimes, it's all that's left. He glanced at her. That why you surrendered? To trade yourself for those kids? Her eyes found his. I thought if I could give the world one good thing before I died, maybe the Creator would let me see my brother again in the afterlife. You still believe that? She shook her head. Not since the soldiers lied. They sat in silence, the river whispering between them. Then came a sound that didn't belong, the soft crunch of boots on gravel. Clay's head snapped up. His hand went to the rifle before he even saw the shadow moving through the brush. A man stepped into the open, tall, broad-shouldered, eyes hard with purpose. His coat was dust-worn military blue, the brass buttons tarnished but still catching light. Bram Gant, Clay said, voice flat as the plains. Didn't think you'd remember, the man replied. His tone was easy, but his hand rested on the revolver at his hip. Heard you crawled out here to play savior. Clay rose to his feet. I'm done with that life. Yeah, I can tell, Gant sneered, eyes sliding toward Tayen. Trading one war for another. Tayen stood, her gaze sharp as flint. You know this man? Too well, Clay muttered. He served under me. Gant's grin didn't reach his eyes. Under you? Hell, Clay, I buried the men you commanded. Buried my brother, too. You remember him? Jonas? The one who took a bullet 'cause you said hold the line? Clay's grip tightened on the rifle. I remember. Then you'll understand why I came. Tayen moved closer, placing herself between them without hesitation. If it's revenge you want, she said, take it somewhere else. Gant's gaze slid over her, cold and cruel. She's the reason you're still breathing, isn't she? Guess I finally know how to make you hurt. Clay stepped forward, the barrel of his rifle rising. Don't. Or what? Gant drawled. You'll shoot another man who trusted you? For a long moment, nobody moved. The desert itself seemed to hold its breath. Then Tayen spoke, her voice clear and steady. You don't get to decide my worth, she said. No man does. Not him, not you, not anyone. Gant's jaw twitched. You think you scare me? I think you hate what you see, she said, taking another step closer. A woman who can't be broken. A soldier who already lost everything. You want to punish him? Then live with what he's become. That's worse than killing him. The words hit harder than bullets. Gant's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Clay watched the fight drain from the man's eyes. His hand slipped from the revolver. For the first time, Gant looked small, not angry, just empty. He turned away. You're already dead, Ryker. You just ain't buried yet. Then he walked off into the night, swallowed by shadow. Tayen didn't move until the sound of boots faded completely. When she finally turned, Clay's eyes met hers. You could have let me take the shot, he said. I did, she replied, but not the one you thought. He almost smiled at that, tired, hollow, but grateful. They sat back down by the dying fire. Both of them changed in ways they didn't yet understand. The air smelled of dust and gun oil, and far off, the first hint of dawn touched the mountains. Clay looked at her. You still want to find those kids? Tayen nodded. More than ever. Then we ride north, he said. For the first time since they met, she didn't argue. The desert had changed by morning. The air turned sharp, the wind colder, the sun no longer gold but white and hard. Clay, Ryker, and Tayen rode north in silence, shadows long and thin across the sand. Neither spoke of Bram Gant or the gun that never fired. Some things didn't need words. They just lived in the space between heartbeats. They stopped at dusk, the sky bleeding crimson over the horizon. Clay built a small fire behind a rocky outcrop, enough to keep warm, but not enough to draw attention. He knew Gant wasn't gone. Men like that didn't leave. They circled, waiting for the right moment. Tayen sat across from him, braiding her hair with slow precision. Her hands were steady, but her eyes never rested. Clay watched her movements, noting how the firelight traced the scar along her forearm, a thin reminder of chains that once bit deep. "You think he'll follow?" she asked. "He's already following," Clay said. "A man like Gant don't know how to let go. He's eaten by his own hate." Tayen's voice was quiet. "Then he's not so different from you." Clay looked up. The words weren't cruel, just true. "Maybe not," he admitted. "Difference is I'm trying to climb out of mine." She met his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "Then you better climb faster, because he's coming." Clay's hand instinctively went to his revolver. The fire popped, and the night grew still. The first shot came from the ridge, a sharp crack that split the dark. Clay dove sideways, tackling Tayen down just as the bullet chewed through the log where she'd been sitting. Dust exploded around them. "Stay low!" he barked. She grabbed his rifle, rolled, and fired into the shadows. The echo bounced off stone, followed by silence. Then, voices. 2, maybe 3. Gant wasn't alone. Clay crouched beside her. "We can't stay here." "You said you don't run from ghosts," Tayen muttered, reloading with practiced speed. "I don't," he said, "but I don't wait to die either." They moved through the rocks, hugging the darkness. Tayen's movements were quick, deliberate, every sense alive. Clay felt the old rhythm return, the soldier in him that knew how to fight, how to survive. But he hated it. Every step brought back the stink of gunpowder and regret. A figure appeared ahead, a man with a rifle slung low. Clay's hand went to his pistol, but Tayen was faster. She swung the butt of her weapon, striking the man clean across the temple. He dropped without a sound. Clay stared at her. "You've done this before." Her voice was flat. "You think I made it here by praying?" He couldn't argue with that. They climbed higher into the rocks, hearts pounding, until the land dropped away into a shallow basin. The moon hung cold above them. Tayen crouched beside a boulder, scanning the ridge. Clay could hear boots crunching, slow, deliberate. "Clay Ryker!" Gant's voice boomed across the canyon. "You still got that savior act going? You think she's gonna thank you when she finds out what kind of man you really are?" Tayen glanced at Clay. "What's he talking about?" "Don't listen," Clay said, his voice tight. But Gant kept talking, his words sharp as a blade. "You didn't tell her, did you? How those Apache families died at Mescal Ridge? How the orders came from you?" Tayen's breath caught. "That's a lie." Clay didn't move. His silence said everything. "You led the raid," Gant shouted. "Burned their camps to the ground. You want to wash your soul clean? You picked the wrong woman to do it with." The world went still. Tayen's rifle dipped slightly. "Tell me he's wrong," she whispered. Clay's voice broke like gravel. "I gave the order, but I didn't know there were children." Her eyes filled with something raw and wordless. Pain, disbelief, fury, all tangled together. "You killed my people," she said, her voice shaking. "I killed my own daughter that same day," he said. "You think I don't live with that?" She raised the rifle halfway, hands trembling. "Then maybe you shouldn't." "Do it," Clay said. He spread his arms, stepping forward. "If you think it'll fix anything, if it'll bring them back, then pull the damn trigger." The air felt like it would break. Tayen's finger hovered on the trigger. Her jaw clenched. Tears streaked through the dust on her face. Then she turned the barrel, not toward him, but toward her own head. Clay froze. "Tayen!" Her voice was fierce and steady now. "No man decides how my story ends. Not you, not him. Not anyone." Gant cursed somewhere above, realizing too late she'd taken his power from him. Clay took that heartbeat to act. He dove for his revolver, firing once, twice into the ridge. A cry rang out. Then silence. When the echo faded, Tayen was still standing, the gun shaking in her hands, eyes wide and wet. Clay moved slowly, taking the weapon from her grip. She let him. He looked her in the eye. "You're right. No one decides for you, but you ain't dying tonight." She sank to her knees, the weight of it all finally breaking her. He crouched beside her, his hand hovering before finally resting on her shoulder. "He's gone," Clay said softly. "It's over." Tayen shook her head. "No, it's never over." He didn't argue. The truth of that hung heavy between them. Above, the stars burned cold and endless, indifferent to everything that happened below. They stayed there until the firelight faded, two broken souls under the same merciless sky. And somewhere in that stillness, a fragile kind of peace began to stir. A truce between pain and survival. When Clay finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "Tomorrow we ride for the caves." Tayen nodded, wiping her eyes. "For the children." "For both of us," he said. The morning after the standoff came colder than it should have. The sky stretched gray and endless, and the air smelled of spent gunpowder and ash. Clay Ryker saddled the mare in silence, every motion heavy, deliberate. Tayen stood a few paces away, staring towards the horizon where the mountains cut the sky like a promise she no longer believed in. Neither of them had slept. The night had left its mark, the kind that didn't fade with dawn. Clay tightened the cinch and said quietly, "We ride at first light." Tayen didn't answer. Her hands were clasped in front of her, trembling, though she'd never admit it. She looked different now. The fire that once lived in her eyes had dimmed, replaced by something colder. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I almost pulled that trigger." He looked at her, jaw tight. "But you didn't." "I should have," she said. "It would have been justice." Clay shook his head. "No, it would have been another grave neither of us could crawl out of." She turned to him then, face hard but glistening with unshed tears. "You killed my people, Clay." He didn't flinch. "I know. And still I'm riding with you." He met her stare, weary but steady. Maybe that's what makes it mean something. For a long moment, the only sound was the creak of saddle leather and the distant call of a hawk. Then Tayen swung onto her horse. "Let's go," she said. They rode north, side by side, but miles apart in silence. The land shifted from scorched plains to cold, high country, the wind biting sharper with every mile. Snow still clung to the peaks in the distance, white against the bruised sky. By midday, clouds had rolled in, carrying a promise of rain. Clay pulled his coat tighter. "We'll need shelter before dark," he said. "There's a pass," Tayen replied. "North of the ridge. The caves aren't far once we cross it." Her voice was sure, but her face told a different story. The strain of hope balanced on the edge of dread. Clay noticed how her eyes kept flicking toward the mountains, as if measuring the distance between guilt and salvation. After a while, she spoke again. "You ever think about what comes after?" "After what?" "After we find them. The children." He shrugged. "Ain't much after for folks like us. Just the next thing that needs doing." She nodded, eyes forward. "Then this is mine." They rode on until the ground turned rocky and steep. The wind howled through the canyons like a dying thing. Tayen's horse stumbled, and she steadied it with a soft word in her native tongue. A sound Clay didn't understand, but somehow felt. "Your people still speak like that?" he asked. "Those of us who are left," she said. "When words are all that survive, you guard them like fire." He thought about that for a long time. By late afternoon, the clouds broke open. Rain came hard and sudden, drumming on their hats, their coats, their bones. Clay motioned toward a cluster of rocks up ahead. "There, we'll wait it out." They dismounted, pulling the horses beneath a narrow overhang. Water pooled at their boots, cold enough to sting. Tayen stood with her arms wrapped around herself, shivering but defiant. Clay took off his coat and held it out. She shook her head. "Keep it." He thrust it toward her anyway. "Ain't negotiable." When she finally took it, she said, "You still think saving me was worth $3? He gave a tired, half smile. "Reckon it's cost me a lot more than that." That almost drew a laugh out of her. Almost. When the rain eased, they started climbing again. The sky turned the color of iron, and the wind carried the bite of snow. Tayen's pace quickened as they neared the pass, her face taut with urgency. "They're close," she murmured. "I can feel it." Clay followed her gaze toward the dark mouth of the canyon ahead. "If they're still alive, we'll find them." "And if they're not?" He paused. "Then we bury 'em right." She looked at him for a long moment, her lips pressed tight, then nodded. As they entered the narrow trail, the world went quiet except for the crunch of hooves on frozen earth. Shadows stretched long across the stone, twisting like smoke. Clay could feel it in his gut, the kind of stillness that comes before something breaks. He drew his rifle from the saddle. "We're not alone." Tayen stopped, listening. The faint echo of movement drifted from the cliffs above, a scrape of metal, the shuffle of boots. She whispered, "Gant?" "Maybe. Or worse." They dismounted, leading the horses behind a boulder. Tayen's breath came fast, white in the cold air. She clutched the small knife she kept hidden at her waist. Clay touched her arm. "You run if it turns bad." Her eyes flashed. "No, I stay." Before he could argue, a figure stepped from the shadows. Not Gant, but a boy, no older than 10. His clothes were ragged, his face pale and hollow. He blinked at them through the rain. Tayen froze. "Lita," she whispered. The boy shook his head. "She's sick," he rasped. "They all are." Clay's heart kicked hard. "Where?" The boy pointed toward the ridge. "In the caves. But hurry, the cold's coming." Tayen's hand covered her mouth. Her eyes shone wet in the half-light, not with fear this time, but with a fierce, aching hope. She turned to Clay. "We ride now." He nodded once. "Then we ride." And together, under the bruised sky and falling snow, they spurred their horses forward, not away from death this time, but toward something worth dying for. The wind came down from the north like a knife, cutting through the canyon as Clay, Ryker, and Tayen rode hard toward the ridge. The rain had turned to sleet, stinging their faces, clinging to their coats. Their horses were spent, breath rising in white plumes against the dark. Still they pressed on. The boy's words echoed in Clay's mind. "They're sick. The cold's coming." Tayen rode ahead, her braid whipping behind her like a black flag. Every time she looked back, he could see it, the fear she was trying not to feel. Hope and terror lived in her eyes now, side by side. When they reached the top of the ridge, Clay spotted the caves, dark mouths yawning open against the rock. Smoke drifted faintly from one, thin as a dying breath. "They're alive," Tayen whispered. Her voice broke. They dismounted, stumbling through the snow. Tayen called out in Apache, her voice echoing off the stone. There was a pause, then a faint reply, small, weak, and impossibly human. A child. She dropped to her knees, tears freezing on her cheeks. "They're here," she said. "Oh God, they're still here!" Clay followed her inside. The cave was dim, lit by a few dying embers. 14 small figures huddled beneath worn blankets, eyes wide and hollow. The air smelled of smoke and fever. One of the older children stirred, a girl with tangled hair and skin too pale for her age. Tayen rushed to her side, cupping her face. "Lita," she said. The girl blinked slowly, lips cracked and dry. "You came back," she whispered. Tayen choked on the words. "I promised." Clay knelt beside a smaller boy, pressing a hand to his forehead. "She's burning up," he said. "All of 'em are." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a tin of dried willow bark. "It's not much, but it'll break the fever." Tayen looked at him, something unspoken in her eyes. Gratitude, maybe, or something deeper. They worked through the night, boiling water, feeding what little broth Clay could make, wrapping the children tighter in blankets. Tayen moved like a spirit among them, whispering in her tongue, touching each child's face as if to count the living. By dawn, a weak light slipped through the cave mouth. The air felt a little warmer, or maybe that was just hope breathing again. Then Clay heard it, the echo of boots against stone. He rose fast, hand on his revolver. "Someone's here." Tayen froze. "Gant?" Clay didn't answer. He moved to the entrance, rifle ready. Outside, snow swirled like smoke. The figure that appeared through it was unmistakable. Bram Gant, hat low, coat torn, eyes cold and mean. "You never learn when to die," Clay said quietly. Gant smirked. "And you never learn when to stop trying to play hero?" Tayen stepped beside Clay, rifle in hand. "You came for revenge," she said. "But all that's left here is mercy. You don't belong." Gant's grin faltered. "Mercy's what got me here." He leveled his gun. "Now it's time for balance." Clay took a step forward, blocking Tayen. "You want me, Gant? I'm right here." But Tayen didn't stay behind. She moved forward too, her voice low and cutting. "No, he doesn't want justice. He wants someone to carry his pain so he can finally drop it." Gant's hands trembled, the gun wavering. "You shut your mouth." She didn't. "You've been carrying the dead so long, you forgot how to live with the living." The words hit him harder than a bullet. Clay could see it, the war in Gant's eyes, the exhaustion in his bones. "Put it down, Bram," Clay said softly. "Don't give the dead another name." For a long moment, the world held still. Snow drifted between them, slow as ash. Then Gant's arm fell. The revolver hit the ground with a dull thud. He turned away, voice rough. "You always were better at talking than shooting, Ryker." Clay exhaled, lowering his rifle. "That makes one of us." Gant looked back once, eyes wet and hollow. "I hope she was worth it," he said. Then he disappeared into the white. The silence that followed felt heavier than gunfire. Tayen's knees gave out, and she sank against the cave wall. Clay caught her before she hit the ground. "He's gone," he said. She nodded faintly. "So are a lot of things." He looked out into the snow. "Maybe that's the point, to let some ghosts walk away." They stayed like that a while, neither speaking. The wind howled through the canyon, but it sounded different now. Not angry, not cruel, just clean. When Tayen finally stood, she looked back at the children, their small shapes bundled close together. "They'll live," she said softly. "Because of you," Clay said. She met his gaze. "Because of us." He smiled, faint but real. "Guess $3 goes a long way." That earned him the smallest laugh. "You paid for a woman," she said, "but you bought your soul." Clay looked away, throat tight. "Maybe." The light outside brightened, gold spilling across the snow. Tayen stepped toward it, her breath visible in the cold air. For the first time, she didn't look hunted. She looked free. Behind her, the children stirred, whispering her name. Clay followed her out into the light, his boots crunching softly on the frozen ground. The land stretched before them, wide and clean, the kind of emptiness that felt like promise. Tayen turned to him and said, "Let's go home." He nodded. "You tell me where that is, and I'll follow." The snow had melted slow, giving the earth back its color. By spring, the mountain pass was green again, patches of wild grass pushing through the thaw, streams running clear and cold. Clay Ryker stood outside May Colby's trading post, sleeves rolled up, mending a fence that wasn't his. He'd been doing that a lot lately, fixing things that didn't belong to him. Tayen came from the barn, her hands dusted with feed. The morning light caught the curve of her cheek, the soft trace of a scar that time hadn't erased. She wore one of May's old coats now, too big at the shoulders but warm enough for the high country. "The fever broke last night," she said. "Lita's awake." Clay smiled faintly, leaning on the post. "Tough little thing. Takes after her." Tayen's eyes flicked toward him, unreadable. "They all do. They remember who saved them." He shook his head. "They don't need to remember me. You think forgetting's the same as forgiving?" He paused, jaw tightening. "I don't figure I deserve either." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. The world had grown quiet since the storm. Too quiet, maybe, but neither of them seemed to mind. Inside the post, May hummed an old hymn while she worked, the sound drifting through the open door. The children, Tayen's children really, laughed somewhere near the river, their voices bright against the morning air. Tayen looked toward the sound, eyes softening. "They'll need a place to stay through summer," she said. "May already offered," Clay replied. "Said she could use the help." Tayen nodded. "And you?" He glanced down at his calloused hands. "Guess I could mend fences a while longer." She tilted her head, studying him. "You could go anywhere, Clay. Start over." He smiled without looking at her. "Ain't that what we're doing?" For a while, neither spoke. A hawk circled above the ridge, calling out to the wide sky. Tayen leaned against the fence beside him, her shoulder brushing his arm. "You ever wonder why we lived?" she asked quietly. "All the time," he said. "And you found an answer?" Clay's gaze drifted towards the horizon where the hills met the clouds. "No, but maybe it ain't about finding one. Maybe it's just about staying alive long enough to deserve one." Her lips curved, just barely. That sounds like something a man who's tired of running would say. He looked at her then, really looked, and saw the same truth reflected back. Neither of them was the person who'd stood on that auction block, or the man who'd bought her for $3. Whatever they were now, it had been earned the hard way. Later that day, May brought out bread and coffee, setting them on the porch. "You two keepin' busy," she said with a knowing smile. "Looks good on you." Clay tipped his hat. "Work's cheaper than whiskey." May snorted. "Maybe, but it don't go down as smooth." Then she turned to Tayen. "You think you'll stay through the harvest?" Tayen glanced at Clay. Maybe, if the fences hold. May winked. Then I'll see that they don't. When May went back inside, Tayen laughed softly, an unguarded sound that made Clay's chest ache in a way he hadn't felt in years. As the sun began to dip, they walked toward the river where the children were skipping stones. The light turned gold, the air warm enough to smell like spring. One of the boys waved when he saw them. "Miss Tayen, Mr. Ryker." Clay raised a hand, feeling something he hadn't in a long time. Peace. Real, quiet peace. Tayen knelt beside the water, dipping her fingers into the current. The surface rippled around her hand, catching the light. "It's strange," she said. "All that death, all that running, and here we are, alive." "Guess the desert didn't want us," Clay said with a half-smile. She looked up at him. "No, we just refused to die." He thought about that for a moment. "So what now?" Tayen watched the river flow, her reflection breaking into pieces on the water. "Now," she said softly, "we live, not because we owe the dead anything, but because we finally don't." The wind stirred, carrying laughter from the children, the creak of the porch, the slow rhythm of a place learning to breathe again. Clay took off his hat and looked at the horizon, the sun bleeding into the hills. "Freedom," he murmured, "costs more than bullets." Tayen turned toward him, eyes glinting like copper in the dying light. "And yet it's the only thing worth paying for." They stood there, side by side, as the sun fell and the first stars lit the sky. For once there was no running, no debts, no ghosts, just the sound of the river and the quiet understanding between them. When the last of the light faded, Clay said, "You ever think $3 could buy something like this?" Tayen smiled, slow and sure. "It didn't buy it," she said. "It just started it." He looked at her then, the fire of twilight in her eyes, and knew she was right. Because sometimes the price of living wasn't in what you paid. It was in what you chose to keep. And as the night settled over the valley, that choice was all they had left. In the end, it wasn't the money, the gun, or the past that defined them. It was the will to keep walking after everything burned. The desert gave them death, but life was the harder thing to hold. So tell me, if forgiveness had a price, would you pay it?